Good evening, I'm Sharaad and welcome to Consider This, the show that tries to update you on some of the latest news and current affairs issues. Now, tomorrow we celebrate the 20th anniversary of SUHACAM, of the National Human Rights Commission. And with me tonight I have Gerald Joseph. He's a member, a second-term member of the Commission, and he's going to help us understand where the Commission is going to be taking the country with it as it goes along. 20 years is a long time, Gerald. You've also only been with them for 3 years, right?
Yeah.
You get another 3-year term, I understand. Tell us, you cast your mind back to 20 years ago when the whole idea of a National Human Rights Commission was mooted. There was some disquiet and some skepticism. Musa Hitam, who was very closely associated because with the Barisan National Government, was going to be its first chairperson. It was housed under Wisma Putra. People thought, well, this is going to be a whitewash. What was do you remember what your own reactions were like?
Well, I was an activist then in the NGO world, so you're right. We absolutely thought that this was symbolic show, that the whole world was doing it. So yeah, you needed something of this nature called a Human Rights Commission. But it was started off with so much of government support and people, including its seconded officers. It was in the vicinity of a government building, but now in hindsight, you think there was a starting times, you know. So I think our initial reaction, if I remember, was even the set of commissioners in the first few sets were largely civil service experience or retired civil service to helm a human rights commission. So that already sprung a lot of light bulbs, like, hey, you need human rights expertise, you know, not government expertise to be human rights commissioners.
Right. But I understand, Gerald, and correct me if I'm wrong, that actually there are global standards for the setting up of a human rights commission, that in fact there's something called the Paris Principles in which human rights commissions are best set up. And to what extent does SUHACAM now conform to those Paris Principles?
So I think just as you're talking about history, SUHACAM needs, and every Human Rights Commission needs to be accredited by this international body in the UN in Geneva every 5 years. So the status A, B or C is very important to show your compliance with a good set of international standards. That's what Paris Principle is called.
All right, they actually assess
the we are status A now.
All right,
and next year we're going to be reassessed, and we hope that we can defend our status A. But going back in history, when we were going to be reassessed in 2008 or 9, the NGO world led by Swaram and the NGO I was with, we all put our names together to actually write a letter to that accreditation body for the downgrading of SUHACAM from A to B. It sounds like a terrible thing to do, but it's the only thing to do.
And deeply ironic, because now that you are a member of SUHACAM.
Exactly.
But tell us why. What were the concerns then about the conduct of SUHACAM, or its structure, its relationship with government?
So I think the first was the selection. That's always important. Paris Principle says the selection must be open, transparent.
Selection of commissions.
Commissions, and the competencies must be put out. This was never known, you know. At that time, it was a direct appointment by the Prime Minister. So that was one of the more important issues that was brought up for amendment by law. And the others was the type of issues that the Commission would take up, you know. How much of the critical issues would they be able to stand up to government and speak the voice as an independent commission. So the word independent is that crucially important one we always want to defend. And at that time, many people thought that we were not up the mark, SUHACAM. And so it was not us who put that letter, it was the committee that sent a letter to SUHACAM, say you are going to be imminent downgrading to B. Please give it's sort of a show cause letter why you think you should be A. And that's when that started swirling around, and we told the government amend, change. I think SUHACAM had done some amendment proposal to the government, but they were not really taking it seriously. But at the height of almost imminent downgrade, that time I think the Minister of Law was Nazri, Dr. Nazri. He then pushed amendment round 1 with some changes. Selection from Prime Minister came down to a selection committee, but they were still not happy because the hand of the selection committee was still not clear. Then went round 2 amendment in Parliament. Of course, I remember the government accusing us of being Western agents and anti-Malaysian and the normal likes, you know. But they still went ahead to do it in order to save the Malaysian, our dignity, our face, which was good. That's how we scraped through to A status.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I do want to ask you though, we're looking back at, say, even the choice of people like Musa Hitam and Abu Talib, as individuals, did they provide a kind of bridging between an authoritarian system and government that perhaps would be reluctant to deal seriously with human rights issues to something like an independent commission? That in fact you needed to gain trust, and you needed to do it by getting people who are on your side, but perhaps are much more sensitive to global conversations about human rights and the need for Malaysia, especially as it had global ambitions, you know, on a diplomatic front. Would you reconsider the skepticism of the past?
So I think the skepticism was valid based on the personalities that were in the commission. I think even presently, honestly speaking, I think it's time for an open, transparent manner of selection of commissioners now. We have a 5-person committee, but we do not know what are the competency tests check. We don't know who are the committee members. It should be made public. I mean, public should know who's the selection committee. So when we go back in time, there was a lot of questions on who this, at one time there were 16 commissioners. You had a big bunch of commissioners, but they never spoke the human rights language, never defended human rights against the tyranny of the state, if that was a word at that time, much more. And I think that's the role of a commission, to advise government on which is the right way to go. Whether government follows you or not, that's another point. But you had to stand up to that test.
Okay, talking about competencies, we've got about a minute and a half. How many people actually, I mean, you actually have a degree, you have a master's degree, a postgraduate degree in human rights. How many people even have that? And is it really necessary? If you come from a trade union background or a women's groups background, do you really need a degree?
So the competency is not to have a master's in human rights. I don't think that is the test. But the test is coming, one of the tests of Paris Principles is to have a diversity of personalities on the commission, which means people who have an understanding of human rights. You can come from any field, so you must have a mix of government, trade unions, NGO, private sector, legal background, academic. You should be open to all, not meaning you need to show your degree, but you should be able to withstand the test of being standing independent, to speak against any groups that violates rights without fear or favor. I think that's a culture that has slowly changed, and I want to congratulate that commission under Tan Sri Hasmi Agam. After the amendment to that law, he took the helm with his set of commissioners, Jenny Lasimbang, James Naigam, and the set of, and Professor Kaur Lekti. I think they did a sterling job to rebrand Suhakam, and I think from that crew of 16 to a tight team of 7 was, I think, the start of a serious looking Suhakam that would take on much more than what it did before.
Right, okay. We'll come back with more on empowering Suhakam after this break. Stay tuned to Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Sharaad Kutin. My guest, Gerald Joseph, is a member of the National Human Rights Commission, Suhakam as it's affectionately known. It celebrates its 20th anniversary tomorrow. The question is whether the nation is going to celebrate along with it. Because it's had some troubles over the last couple of years, especially under the Najib administration. There was a slash in funding and so on and so forth. I mean, to what extent did you feel, I mean, coming into the commission, in fact, the tail end of the Najib administration, did you feel a hostility from the government or the administration at that point in time?
I think the culture was, the commission is a statutory body, so by law, respect needs to be given. So they would invite you in to sit and discuss, but never take you seriously. Our opportunities to meet at the highest level with ministers or secretary generals was very far in between. For an example, We only managed to get, I think, meet 2 ministers in that 2 years under the Najib administration. We tried, not for lack of trying, and we could not. And so our role to advise government on serious policy matters was difficult. On law reform, we are supposed to advise government on what's good for law, but you get invited the day before the law is passed in Parliament. I mean, same complaints by the members of Parliament, I believe. So it's not the best way to go forward. So we were never taken seriously as an entity on the side of advising government in a better way to comply with human rights.
But what about the slashing of funds? Because that's significant. I mean,
Yeah.
your operations, I mean, you get over 1,000 complaints, and you have, by all accounts, a small team of 80 people or so to work with. I mean, slashing funds must have a detrimental effect on your ability to work.
So I think that was, if I'm not mistaken, 3.5 years or 4 years ago, when 50% was slashed, and they justified saying it was a cut across the board. But it affected the commission. Even at present, the commission gets roughly about 10 million ringgit a year. For a staff of 85 plus 8 or 9 commissioners now, that's hardly, that's about 92% just for paying salaries of staff, because you can't cut that, they are there. And commissioners are not paid full time, they are only paid allowance. And you only have about 8 to maybe 9% to do program, which is very strange in an organization. Paris Principle demands that the government adequately fund your Human Rights Commission. So we are underfunded before. When the new government took over, we brought this case up to Finance Minister Mr. Lim Guan Eng, and after listening to our story, we told you, we don't need to convince you how bad prison, and he said, I know, I've been there. And then he added 2 million ringgit to that. So that was our first take on increasing. The test is coming up in a few weeks' time in Parliament, whether we will get the additional funds. But I
want to ask you, I mean, is it about the way that the government considers or thinks about the role of Suhakam? If you compare Suhakam to other statutory bodies, the Election Commission and all these, is it comparable? Are you treated on an equal level with them?
If I must give you some nitty-gritty example, it will sound petty, but just to prove the comparability with other commissions, I think Anti-Corruption Commission has a huge chunk of work, so you can't compare, but they get about 230 million ringgit, which is probably under budgeted for them, and we get about 10 to 12 million ringgit. So you can't go far with that staff and the amount of complaints we receive. And also, we've been requesting, I mean, in the civil service or statutory body, they give you vehicles, the vehicles are 13 to 14-year-old, they're breaking down all the time. And you wonder how come for Human Rights Commission, there's nobody's like looking after us. Other groups that after 5 years, 6 years, you don't spend money repairing the car. So it's just an example of how we've been we are there, but just on a corner. And I think that needs to change. To take the role and function of the Human Rights Commission seriously, because many people walk into our office with their complaints on human rights. The Sabah office gets about 50 complaints a month. Here in Semenanjung, KL, about 50 complaints. Sarawak, about 26 complaints a month. So people are using that avenue to maybe vent, maybe hope for some justice. And this is serious work, and you need to actually fund us to expand our staff team in order for Suhakam to really be a household name.
Right. I mean, when you look at the present government, the Pakatan Rakyat administration, there are various people with different experiences when it comes to either being victims themselves of human rights violations. Mat Sabu was under the Internal Security Act. I mean, the Defence Minister, Lim Guan Eng, as you said, was imprisoned for defending that young girl. So many people, but not all of them, right?
Correct.
And so is there an unevenness in terms of understanding the importance of human rights work to governance in the current administration?
So I think as you pointed out, there was no difficulty in asking to meet ministers when they came into power in the last 1 year. I think within a year we managed to meet 10 ministers plus the Attorney General plus the Prime Minister, first time ever. Suhakam has met so many in a period of 12 to 13 months, which means you did not need to convince them of our role and function because they understood what it was. But I think there lies the challenge. It's the whole system change has not happened. We are working with the top brass who you don't need to convince, they understand what you're saying, but then after they go off, it's the second tier, third tier, which is still the same civil service that actually need to come on board as human rights partners. So I think their jailing or their victims of the human rights violation in the many years actually is a good testament for them doing good policies, but there is now a disjoint in the implementation part that I think Malaysia is seeing. You know, all the promises to change, to do this is not really happening.
I want to take up some of the recent cases like the raids that we've had on Shia communities, you know, over the last couple of days. And this, I know Suakam has issued a statement about this, very concerned about these raids. There we see maybe actions or behavior of government coming from different authorities, not necessarily under the control of cabinet, right? So this would be the religious authorities, the police, for instance, might have their own mind when it comes to this. Is that the tougher game now? Working with police, working with religious authorities to get them to appreciate these human rights principles and having them to conform to them?
Correct. I think the working with the police, they have been, police, prisons, immigration have been our closest partners because of our visits to the detention centers, all the complaints linked with a lot of enforcement. So we've had a to and fro relationship, and I would say in the last year there's much more openness in the police to work with us. So it's not with the police that is difficult because there's a whole reform agenda with the IPCMC. So I think our recent meeting with the IGP was very positive. You know, he says there's no two ways about things. We need to clean the house up, and I'm here to clean it up. So I think on that score it's fine, but there is a defensiveness when the Human Rights Commission comes in. They always think we are out to attack them. You know, I don't know where they get this idea. I mean, if you see something not right, we have to spell it out, but we are there to work to make it better. You know, we're not there to grind you to the ground and kick you out. That's not our role. But somehow or other, when we come in, it's so, to hear these critical words are painful for them, and they take it personally.
Right. Is it because, of course, over the years there hasn't been that kind of scrutiny? It's something. It's a kind of cultural change that needs to happen in governance.
Totally agree, and I think that's why human rights must be a common norm of this government. They should not shy away and feel like, don't touch this because this is sensitive. You know, there are groups that are out to attack human rights, and you mentioned about the Shia raid. So we voiced our concern like we did before, even in the old government. We said the same things, you know, hoping that there will be new ways of handling such delicate matters. I mean, given that Malaysia has a different view of how to handle the Shia and Sunni, you know, but there must be some other way of moving forward. Dialogue, discussion. You don't need raids to put them down all the time. And Malaysia was part of the Aman message that actually respects Islam world as having different schools of thoughts, and I think our Prime Minister then, Tun Badawi, was part of that meeting.
Yeah, and I think Khairi Jamaluddin also one of the many signatories to that, right? I think there were a couple, a handful of Malaysian politicians. Very quickly, do you think, and are you confident that this government promising to roll back the repressive laws we associated with 5 decades of Barisan National rule, do you think that's going to happen? Are people very impatient? Sedition Act has not been repealed, so on and so forth.
So I still believe it's going to happen. At least they're struggling to make it happen, which is a good sign. There's so many interagencies meeting that we have been party to. I think NGOs are also party to. Never before NGOs have been kept out of the loop. And so I think this kind of meetings where ministers are calling and they're getting input to discuss, to get the heat and then have a reaction, I think is a good way. Whether we will see it happening before their 5-year term is up, I think the rollout is happening. But it should be done in a more informative way. It's not like we are playing a guessing game. Like this coming parliament, which one is coming? So we look at the long list and we are playing. I think it shouldn't be. You can tell us, okay, these 3 I'm trying to do, the others are difficult. No problem. We'll have patiently work with you for the other thing. But I think this government needs to step up its work on not only the policy and law reform, but actually take up the more difficult issues, especially on the race and religious issue, which is a bane in Malaysia for a long time.
Right, okay, we'll take another break. Stay tuned to Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Sharaad. With me, Gerald Joseph. He's a commissioner with the National Human Rights Commission, Suhakam, we call it. Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of this key institution, an institution that was kind of sense a harbinger of a democratic Malaysia, right? It was, so much of it was an aspirational thing. Now, tell us about civil society. You said civil society activists are now being invited to inter-ministerial meetings and to inform government on policy and such. Have they themselves been able to be good interlocutors with government? I mean, you know, we assume that the civil society movement is mature, is knowledgeable, and so on and so forth, but is that in fact true? What's your sense of the competencies of the civil society movement itself?
So I think, our date of birth is 9/9/99, so a few days ago. But tomorrow we have a big forum to celebrate the 20 years. So in the last 20 years, civil society like Suhakam was also seen as an anti-government group many times, but more so for civil society. And also at sometimes, I remember a particular incident where we went to submit a memorandum to the earlier commission, and we were not even allowed in by the Secretary General then. No? He said, oh, there's no commissioner here to see you, and he actually blocked us at the door. And this doesn't happen now anymore. It's really open, and partnership with civil society is like crucially important if we want to get the expertise going. So one of it, civil society can provide expertise because the NGO is set up for a particular issue. Health, we call the health type NGOs, maybe on legal reform, the legal type. So I think there is a wide range of expertise, and it's better to use their brains than try to crack our brains for everything. So I think that's one thing. Number two, from a government point of view, we have played interlocutor role between civil society and government in the old administration. I think in this new administration, government has their address and email much more direct. So you don't need us really in that function, which is a very good and positive thing. So I think the competencies that now civil society would need, as opposed to before, you know, before we used to be shouting out there and fighting, and I thought I saw you somewhere. So
yeah, I've been there in the crowd too.
Yeah. So I think now it's actually sitting down and helping them make it happen. You know, if we want a law reform, what is the nitty-gritty stuff that makes a change? And
so you're looking for collaborators, or you think NGOs need to kind of refashion themselves to be much more collaborative with government?
Correct, yeah. So that's collaborative with some technical input, and yet oversight eyes to shout out when they are not doing it. You know? So I think this three-in-one position means you can sit with them and talk and have a cup of coffee seriously, and the moments when you slip down, they will actually go back to say, hey, come on, I told you loudly here.
Well, I wonder about this, because a lot of people are concerned about activists being co-opted into this government, right, as a whole, generally, into various functions, whether there's press secretaries or personal assistants to ministers and so on and so forth. Does that neutralize the civil society movement as a pressure group, which is a kind of core dynamic in vibrant democracy, a pressure group to make sure that, you know, government doesn't get complacent, that it isn't allowed to say, yes, we're going to do it, and then just let time, you know, run away with it. So is that lost? Have we lost that pressure element in the dynamic?
So I think in all honesty, the best assets have been stolen for Malaysia at different points of history. 98 Reformasi is a big group that went into politics. In 2013, that GE, when there was a big change, many have gone into politics. And then now, more recent general election, many have gone into government. I see it as a positive contribution. I mean, if people know the issue and they go in. But if your question is whether they forget their role now inside, I think not. But whether their function will be different from when they were outside is definitely important. You need to know you don't shout anymore. You have to make it happen. But then that leaves civil society with very few really left behind. And there's always rejuvenation happening. There's a lot of young voices. There are also senior activists. There are not so many, but I think it's a more conscious effort Malaysians at large the last 1 year plus to actually make the reform agenda work. I mean, what's the point of all the demonstration and the vote for change when actually change is not happening? So I think many people put their minds and hearts, like the IRC, the Reform Committee, they submitted documents after document. So with every bill now, they want to make it happen. So your question is whether they have lost that voice and energy and fervor. I don't think they've lost it, but it's a strategic move at this time to get it happen. But if you think for once they'll be quiet, I don't think so. The moment will happen.
Okay. In the last bit that we have, Gerald, what would you like people generally to kind of, how can they help Suhakam? How can they be involved?
So I think Suhakam has been named many things, unsavory things from the last 20 years, from toothless tiger to supporters of the government. But I think we've come a long way. And that means there's a lot more work to be done, and we definitely need collaborators. We need Malaysians to demand government to put money into human rights. And I use the word human rights loosely. Part of it is a commission, part of it is civil society, part of it is retraining staff. So I think one is putting money. Number two, for Suhakam, we want more people to come out and be with us, to be voice for human rights, to tell the government, do not be afraid of signing treaties. I mean, why are we in the bunch of 15 countries that don't dare sign ICED? Why are we so afraid to ratify ICC? I mean, where did that come from? We need more Malaysians to say human rights is okay because I believe in human rights. I do not believe human rights is a Western notion. You can go to the most remote village in Malaysia, in Sarawak, Sabah, or even Africa, which I've done a lot of training. You can ask anybody who doesn't know the UN declaration, can still tell you I have rights and this is important for me. So I think that notion that it's Western, it's anti-religion or anti-Islam or anti-Christian, I think we need to throw that away, and we need local common Malaysians standing with us and say human rights belongs to us.
Okay, thank you so much, Gerald.
Thank you.
I've been speaking to Gerald Joseph. He's a member of Suhakam, the National Human Rights Commission. It celebrates its 20th anniversary. They're having a big celebration tomorrow. As Gerald pointed out, the anniversary was on the 9th of the month. That's all we have for Consider This tonight. I'm Sharaad, only on Astro AWANI. Thanks.
Thank you.